Welcome, Karan, to this interview. I'm sure you're frequently being part of revenge interviews. So to begin with, this won't be a revenge interview. This will be just a normal interview. So you come from a very privileged background. You are the son of a chief of army staff, and you studied in the very, let's say, blue-edge school, so to speak of. Why did you choose to become a journalist? You could have become anything, an academic, a bank, a corporate job. But why become a journalist?
The truth is that when I was at university, I was very keen to be an academic. And I left Cambridge and went to Oxford, where I did my PhD in international relations. But it was during those 3 years at Oxford that I began to start writing for a British magazine called The Spectator. It interested me, it fascinated me, it was an opportunity to travel. I went to Afghanistan, Pakistan, a couple of other countries on their behalf. And I found that I got hooked to the idea of writing. And the more I got hooked to the idea of writing, to journalism, to reporting, the less I was interested in academics thereafter. So I didn't finish my PhD. I said that I will get a job, which I did with the Times in London, and thought that I would be able to do the PhD while doing the job. But your job takes over your life. And journalism is a very demanding profession. And that thesis never got written, and I ended up a journalist instead.
What was the thesis on, just for curiosity's sake?
It was an attempt to study the non-alignment of Nehru, Nkrumah, and Sukarno.
Speaking of moving on, you have achieved fame as an interviewer, a hard-hitting speaker who pulls no punches when you are taking an interview of another person. And some of the one we just saw now, you had Kapil Dev crying during his interview, you had Narendra Modi walking out, Ram Jethmalani walking out, but yet you managed to remain friends with many of them. How did you do that? But for Narendra Modi, of course. But how did you manage to strike that balance? Because these were people who were angry and walked out in a huff. And yet, I think Ram Jethmalani and you were good friends all throughout.
And Ram Jethmalani came back and did 2 or 3 more interviews with me. And in fact, the truth is that Jayalalitha was very upset at the end of that interview. But when I met her at the National Integration Council meeting, I was talking to Naveen Patnaik, and she walked up and joined us. And when she walked up and joined us, I started to distance myself because I assumed the last person in the world she'd want to meet is me. And as she saw me leaving, she said, "Where are you going? I've come to talk to you, not Naveen. I talk to him all the time." So I said, "But I didn't think you'd want to talk to me." And she looked at me, she said, "Of course I want to talk to you. And in fact, when are you coming to do another interview? I'm waiting for it."
Really? She said that?
Absolutely. When are you coming to do another interview? I'm waiting for it. Sadly, that interview never happened. But the answer to your question is that I am very conscious of the fact that all human beings have egos. They have a sense of their own self-esteem. And when you've been through a difficult, tough interview, you have, in a sense, knocked that sense of ego they have, that esteem. And I make every effort thereafter to make up. Obviously, I don't apologize for the interview. In no way do I express regret for the interview. But there are other ways that you can be personable, that you can be likable, and that you can help restore their esteem. And that's what I do. And I think that's one reason why people do return for a 3rd, 4th, and 5th interview, because they realize there is no ill will in Karan. He's not doing this because he wants to get at me. He's doing it because he's doing a job. It's how he believes the job needs to be done. And therefore, because they don't see any animus in me, they're happy to return for a 2nd, 3rd, or 4th interview.
But having said that, what about the Prime Minister? I don't think he has ever given an interview after that very famous Dosti Bane Rakhe,
He
right?
hasn't even spoken to me after that.
Have you tried for an interview after that?
Several times. After he became Prime Minister, I've written him, I can't remember now how many letters, but there would be at least 5 or 6, maybe 7 or 8, suggesting that we should do interviews, explaining to him that the last interview had not ended on the happiest of terms, but that maybe both of us as adults could put it behind us, that it was in our combined interest to carry on doing interviews. He needed to speak to the world, I needed to speak to the Prime Minister, but he didn't even bother to acknowledge those letters. The only conversation I had with him was 24 hours after the recording of the interview, when it was broadcast by CNN IBN the next day. And by then I was back in Delhi, and he rang me up and he said, "Tumne mere kandhon pe bandook rakh ke goli mari hai." And I said to him, I said, Modi
Do you
sir,
mind
of
translating
course,
that?
you've,
Because
you've
not...
kept your gun on my shoulder and fired. And I said to him, I said, Mr. Modi, I had said to you yesterday that if you only do a 2 or 3 minute long interview and walk out after that, it will become a news item. It will be shown in every bulletin. It will be shown 36 times in the day. It will become a controversial talking point. But if you do the full interview, it will be shown repeated once and forgotten forever. I said, you didn't take my advice. I said, I was very keen that you should do it. I stayed behind for a whole hour trying to persuade you to understand things my way, but it didn't work. And he laughed and he said, chalo choro. And his words were, Karan, brother, I love you. When I come to Delhi, we'll have a meal together. Well, he's been in Delhi for the last 11 years. I don't know about love, but there's certainly been no meal together either.
Do you regret that interview at any point of time, Karan?
Not at all.
Because the BJP has not been very accessible to you after that, any of the leaders,
I
right?
don't regret that interview at all. I was doing a job. I was doing it to the best of my ability. If I had that opportunity again, I would undoubtedly do it the same way. The moment in the interview that I suspect Mr. Modi didn't like and that propelled him to walk out was the very first opening question.
Would you change that? Would you change that question, maybe ask that a little later, so that the interview continued for some more time, when you look back?
You know, I thought about that a lot before I actually started the interview. I knew I had to speak to him about 2001. It was important and essential. But I wasn't certain in my mind whether I should do it at the start and get it over with, whether I should do it somewhere in the middle, or leave it towards the end. And then I said to myself, if I don't begin with it and get it over with, it'll be hanging like a sword of Damocles over our head. And at all points of time, he'll be anticipating in his mind, when is he going to ask me that question? When is he going to ask me that question? And it would make for undue, unnecessary tension. I said it's better and sensible and cleaner to begin with it, spend 2-3 minutes on it, get it out of the way, and then go on to other things, which is why I chose to start with it. The second thing is that the question actually said to him, if I recall correctly from memory, Prime Minister Modi, India Today magazine and the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation consider you the best chief minister in the country. But 140 million Muslims look upon you as a mass murderer. Do you have an image problem 6 weeks before your next election? And I deliberately use that term, mass murderer, rather than a euphemism or a softer way of saying it, because I said to myself, the truth is that is precisely what Muslims do call him. In their private homes, in their private conversations, that is precisely how they refer to him. Now, he's a politician and he should know what people think of him. He should hear the truth. It's for him to learn how to handle it. If I were to put it in a softer, milder, euphemistic way, I would not be conveying the strength of feeling and the truth of what Muslims think. So I said, no, I will use the phrase Muslims use. He's a politician. He should need to take it. I don't think he liked it. I can understand that. I think he was perhaps offended by it. He said to me that it was only people like Karan Thapar who thought like this. And I said to him, I said, no, Prime Minister, you're mistaken. The Chief Justice of India in open court has called you a modern-day Nero who deliberately looked the other way as innocent children and helpless women were burned to death. And he said to me, if I recall correctly, that was not part of a written judgment. At that point of time, I thought it wasn't part of a written judgment. I found out afterwards that, in fact, it was. It was a written judgment published and released by the Supreme Court in April 2004. But I said to him, even if it's not part of a written judgment, it was a comment made in open court by the Chief Justice of India. The papers have picked it up. It's been recorded. The country's heard it. Are you saying to me it doesn't matter to you that this is how the Chief Justice thinks of you? And we didn't go much further than that. I think the interview lasted for 2 minutes and 30 seconds or 40 seconds. He said he wanted a glass of water. I said, it's by your side, please help yourself. But he said, as you've heard him say, dosti bani rahe, and he got up and left.
But having said that, Karan, do you think that the age of the very tough questioning, confronting interviews are over? Because now you don't see those kind of interviews on television anymore. I mean, maybe you get to see it once in a while on the BBC, but otherwise, if you're talking to the ministers of Indian ministers of the central government or to even leading politicians, many of them seem to be pampered and the questions are very easy on them. What is your opinion about the age of the interrogative interview, so to speak of?
I think the interrogative interview is always going to be, and outside India continues to be, a very important format of how you interview people. It's not the only type of interview, but it is one very important type of interview when the object of the exercise is to make someone accountable, particularly politicians or senior businessmen and industrial leaders, people who are accountable to the public. You have to be persistent, determined, assertive. I'm deliberately not using the word aggressive because aggressive tends to be pejorative in its connotations. But it is important for you to be persistent, determined, and insistent because you are asking a question, and if you believe it's an important question to ask, it's important to get an answer. It's a courtesy to your audience who are listening. They are making an effort to listen, they're making time, they're following the question you're asking. If you don't get an answer to the question, why is the audience listening to you? It's a discourtesy to them. If you simply ask the question, get fobbed off by a non-answer, the audience feels cheated. And they will turn around and say, this is a waste of time. He asks a question, he doesn't get an answer, he doesn't bother about it, and he moves on to something else. Now, if that is what has become the way you interview politicians in India, then it is deeply sorrowful and sad. Because politicians, top industrialists, many other people need to be made accountable. That is the job of a good journalist, to hold people to account. It doesn't mean to say that you're presiding over them like some judge or jury, but you're doing a job of asking questions. Sometimes they are tough questions. Sometimes they are very simple questions that people just don't want to answer. But the job is to ask those questions and to get an answer.
You've been accused of being rude, arrogant, you interrupt people and you kind of, drive them into a corner. What are your replies to those kind of perceptions about your style of interviewing?
I hope I'm not rude and arrogant. If I am, I would be very sorry and upset because I think there is no excuse for being rude. But firm, determined, insistent, yes, I am. If being firm is perceived as being aggressive, so be it. I think being firm is assertive, not aggressive. I think being determined and insistent simply suggests that you are single-minded in moving on. If it's mistaken for rudeness, then that is, I think, as much a problem in the eyes of the beholder as it is in mine. But if you're rude, which is impolite, and if your tone becomes nasty, then the fault is yours.
You have been a senior journalist, and so perhaps imagine yourself as a junior person who's gone to interview somebody very important, and he or she doesn't get the interview, and you come back and tell your editor that you haven't got the interview. The reception would be very different from you telling your partner or maybe to Siddharth Varadarajan, look, I haven't got the interview because he or she walked out of the interview. But what about a junior person and a politician walks out like that? Do you think it would be possible for a person beginning his career or in a far more junior position than where you are now?
A lot of times journalists get promised interviews and politicians or industrialists or actors or editors or musicians or singers, whoever the interview is, backs out. It's unfortunate when it happens. Sometimes people back out because they have good, genuine reasons for doing so. Something has come up which was unexpected and they don't have the option or the opportunity to give the interview. On other occasions, people back out because they've changed their mind. They leave you high and dry.
Yes.
That does happen. It's wrong. I think it shouldn't happen. When you've made a commitment, you should carry it through to the extent you can. But I would be perfectly understanding if a colleague of mine went, did an interview and came back and found that the person backed out. Or if people have walked out. I've had colleagues working with me who've done interviews with politicians, and politicians have called it off or backed out in the middle. It's sad when it happens. It shouldn't happen. It's wrong, but it does.
No, that's nothing. It's to include an interactive session with the audience. We're very keen to talk to you towards the end.
Sure.
Nothing, nothing to be worried or perturbed about. Karan, moving on, like you've interviewed so many celebrities. Is there someone in modern Indian history, say from that you would have loved to interview?
Are there people I would love to have interviewed?
From modern, from say from the 20th century onwards, not too far back.
Oh, I'm sticking to people who are alive. I would love to have had an opportunity to interview Sonia Gandhi. I asked her several times. She accepted on several occasions. I remember once meeting her at a reception and saying, Mrs. Gandhi, what about the interview you promised? You promised it a long time ago. And she laughed and she said, but I didn't say when. And she was right. She didn't say when, but she never gave it. I think, obviously, people have a right not to give interviews when they don't want to, but I would love to have interviewed her. I would love to interview President Trump. I would love to have interviewed Margaret Thatcher when she was Prime Minister of Britain. Going further back in time, to politicians who have fascinated me, and you see, mine is a political bent of mine, so the people I'm identifying tend to be politicians, but I would love to have interviewed JFK, Pandit Nehru, Indira Gandhi. I would love to have interviewed Mahatma Gandhi.
I was waiting for that. But moving on, there is this trend of people who you want to interview. For instance, if you met Sonia Gandhi now, what is the one question you would have loved to ask? If you were given just one question, what would you have asked Sonia Gandhi?
I don't know is the honest answer.
I'm sure you must have thought about it a lot, isn't it, Karan?
I thought about interviewing her, but not about the questions I would ask her, because the questions would depend entirely on the circumstances in which the interview is happening. What were the issues that were topical? What were the issues that she's involved in? What are the issues that require her to comment on them? So I've never got so far as to think what would be the first question I'd ask her. But if you ask me the same question about Narendra Modi, if you were to ask me, if Narendra Modi agrees to give you an interview, another interview after the one he walked out on, what would be the first question you'd ask him? And my first question would be, अगर आपको प्यास लगी है, तो पानी अभी पी लीजिएगा. If you're feeling thirsty, drink your water now.
But there were times, I believe, that when people now who want to be interviewed, Mr. Narendra Modi, for instance, would like the questions to be given to them. I believe that that's now he goes for interviews. You have also done that. You've given questions to Barack Obama, I believe, before the interview, and also to Mr. Chidambaram, who wanted to see the interview before it went on air, right?
That's right. Mr.
Why did you
Chidambaram
agree
didn't
to
get
do
the
that?
questions in advance, but Mr. Chidambaram certainly wanted to see the interview before it went on air, because he wanted to have the right to vet it and deny us the right to show it. And when the interview happened, he turned to his advisor who was in the room, a gentleman called Mr. Gangopadhyay, and asked him if the interview was okay. And this very embarrassed gentleman said, oh, yes, absolutely, no problem with it at all. And Rajdeep and I had decided that we would be absolutely honest with the audience. And we began the interview with the caption which said that this interview has been recorded on the condition that Mr. Chidambaram will have the right to see it and decide if it can be shown. And at the end, when the interview ended, we wrote, Mr. Chidambaram had no problem and the interview has been broadcast exactly as recorded. And he was very upset, extremely angry that we had put up those two captions. I said, but why are you upset? I said, if you felt you had a right and you were doing an honorable thing in setting that condition, why are you embarrassed that the world's found out about it? If you're upset and embarrassed that the world has found out about it, then the condition you were setting was dishonorable, in which case, I've exposed your dishonorable behavior.
But would you have given the same privilege to Mr. Modi, supposing he says that he comes to you for an interview and he says he wants to vet it? Would you give him that same kind of leeway?
No.
Why not?
Because I'm older, wiser, and I realize that, in fact, politicians don't like the truth being told about themselves. So, no, I wouldn't give that. In fact, to be honest, I would never give questions in advance. And that's very different to someone not having the questions but wanting to check the interview after it's recorded. I would never give questions in advance to a politician. Politicians are being held to account. They are supposed to be able to handle questions on subjects that they are in command of. They don't need to know in advance what they're getting, but if they're intelligent people, they can quite easily work out what the question is likely to be. However, if an author, a musician, a singer, a dancer, a director of films were to say to me, can you share with me the questions? I wouldn't have a great problem because I'm not holding them to account. It's a very different sort of interview I'm doing. What I would do with politicians, and this happens all over the world, is I would happily brief them on the subjects I will raise. That is very different to telling them the questions. So I'm quite happy to say to politicians, I'll be talking to you about Sindhur, I'll be talking to you about cricket, I'll be talking to you about Pakistan, trade, tariffs. What I'll be asking about those issues, I will not tell you. But these are the subjects I'm telling you that I will raise so that they can brief themselves. That happens all over the world.
You also but share the questions with Obama, isn't it?
At his specific request. And that was not an interview being done for broadcast purposes. It was an interview being done for the Hindustan Times Conclave, where Mrs. Bhartia, who's the owner and editorial director of the paper, had asked me to interview Obama. Obama's office sent a message to Mrs. Bhartia to say, can the questions be made available to us? And she rang me up and said, look, would you be willing to do it? Because if you don't, there's a very good chance he'll back out. And she'd paid a very sizable sum of money to bring him to India. And since this wasn't a media interview, it was being done for a conclave audience, an invited audience of 1,000 or 1,500. I said, sure. I gave, and you've got the story from my book. I gave the questions. They came back and identified that there were 4 questions they didn't want asked. And I made an absolute point of asking all of those 4 questions.
And he answered and he replied to those.
Well, he had no choice. He had to reply to them. He wasn't terribly happy being asked those questions. But frankly, some of those questions are innocent, innocuous, and fun. It was one of the questions he didn't want to be asked was the last question. It was the send-off question. It was the question that would end the interview. And the idea was to send the audience home smiling or laughing. And the question was, America is famous for 2 Donalds. Donald Trump and Donald Duck. Which of the Donalds is more representative of the country? And he didn't like it. He didn't want the question asked. And I said to myself, the man hasn't got a sense of humor. But ask the question I did. And he went off into a very rather boring answer. I can't remember the answer, but it was dull and boring and completely missed the sentiment or the thought of fun behind the question.
Often when we get to interview people, we expect them to answer in a certain way, or you expect the interview to go in a certain direction from what you learn about them, you read about them, you listen to what they talk, and so on. Were there times when people surprised you or disappointed you? Can you talk about that during an interview?
There are many times when people's answers have surprised me, but whether I can remember specific occasions would be probably very difficult. But, you know, good interviewees often hold something in reserve so that they can add something that is new, that will attract attention and be remembered as something they've said. The interviews that I have seen where this often happened was with Margaret Thatcher in England in the 80s when I was working with London Weekend Television. Several occasions when it happened with smaller British politicians, because remember, I spent 10 years in that environment. It's happened in India with people like L.K. Advani, who I've interviewed many, many times, Mani Shankar Iyer, Sitaram Yechuri. Those are people who come instantly to mind. They would often surprise you either by the candor of what they'd said or the additional detail that they'd thrown up, which I wasn't aware of. And that makes an interview much more fascinating, much more interesting, much more challenging as well.
But yet Advani had a problem when you asked him something in Hindi and he took it to mean that you bring out the demon and something like that, right? Would you like to talk about that? An interview when he was upset about the question that you asked.
He was not so much upset about a specific question, but the general tenor and tone of that interview. This was done shortly after he had stopped being president of the BJP, and the new person who'd taken over from him I think this was done in 2006 or 7, if I remember correctly. And I think the new president was Rajnath Singh, but I'm saying that from memory, so forgive me if I'm mistaken. And what I did in the interview was to point out to Mr. Advani that in 4, 5 or 6 distinct areas, policies that he'd stood for, statements that he'd made, had been revoked and countermanded, and the direction changed by his successor. Yeah. And he felt uncomfortable answering those questions because he said that you're inviting me to speak against my successor, or you're exposing differences within the party, which as a former party president, it's difficult for me to acknowledge. Why don't you do the interview again? Ask me anything else. And I said, Mr. Advani, I've done the right interview. This was the important issue to talk to you about. To not go public with this interview would be wrong. And I was aware that it would upset him. I was aware that it would damage a relationship that was 10 or 12 years old. But what choice did I have? You know, sometimes it is difficult for journalists to be friendly with politicians. And frankly, I don't think journalists should ever become very close to politicians, particularly politicians that you are liable and likely to interview. Because then there is an expectation that I'm being interviewed by a friend, he will be kind, he will be thoughtful, he will be sympathetic. That's the expectation in their mind. On your part, you're doing a job, you're being persistent, you know that this is an issue that you have to raise, you know you have to go with it to a particular point and even further if you can, and that upsets them. Which is why I say journalists should never be very close to politicians, and particularly not to politicians that you are likely and liable to interview.
Do you see that happening now in the present day world when journalists become chums with politicians? They are more like they write stuff for them, they do their ghostwriting for them. That happens across the board. So what is your opinion on that?
Well, if a journalist wishes to be writing speeches for a politician, then at that point of time and for the duration of that relationship, he stops being a journalist. He becomes a staff member of a political team. Hopefully at some point when he returns to journalism, his attitude to the politician will be very different. There are journalists in the world who've done this, who've worked with politicians, but that was at a time when they were not journalists, and now they are journalists and they become front-rank journalists, and their attitude and behavior is very different. But a lot of journalists I see today, particularly on television, like to convey the impression and the image that they are personally very close and trusted by politicians, and I think that's a wrong impression for journalists to convey. It is not a journalist's duty to appear to the world as if he's chummy with a politician. It's not a journalist's duty to be, during the course of the interview, calling the politician by his first name. So you don't say Piyush or Nirmala or Sita. You say Mr. Yuchuri or Minister. Because that formality creates a definite distance between the two of you, and that distance is the distinction that I'm a journalist, you're a politician, I have a job to do, and at the moment we are not friends. There's a professional relationship between us, and this distance helps establish it. But the second you begin to call the politician you're interviewing Piyush or Nirmala or whatever else, you're suggesting a chumminess, and the audience then cannot accept that you will be tough with someone. Just the opposite is true. You must never put people on a pedestal, I would say, and call them sir. Because you're never tough with someone you call sir. When you call someone sir, you're putting them on a pedestal, you're suggesting a deferential relationship, maybe even, God forbid, a reverential relationship. And once again, just like chumminess, it comes in the way of being tough. You're not tough with someone you call sir. You're not tough with someone that you're friendly with and keep calling Piyush, Piyush, Piyush. But you can establish a correct relationship if you say Mr. Goyal or Mrs. Sita Raman or Minister. That's why how you address a politician is very important. Of course, it's a completely different thing when you are doing an interview with a musician or a director or a singer or an actor. Then you can quite happily call them by their first names, because it's a different type of interview. The need for that distance is not there.
Any regrets about that Kapil Dev interview when Kapil Dev wept and, had to show that, he was honest and how he had worked and so on. Any regrets about that?
No, none at all. Why would there be regrets? I had a job to do, a question to ask. He obviously touched him somewhere. I wasn't happy that I had made a man cry, but I wasn't regretful that I had done it because I was doing my job. And he has, as a human being, a right to show his emotions if he wishes to. If the emotions he wishes to show are tears and this sort of emotion, that's his prerogative. Many people felt afterwards that perhaps he'd put it on. I don't think he had at all. I think it was a genuine emotion. I don't think he was showing to the audience that he was guilty. The tears were not tears of guilt, but they may well have been tears of a certain anger at himself for having allowed himself to be in a position where he could be misinterpreted.
Karan, like we said earlier, the BJP does not permit you access to their ministers and so on. Has that affected your career? Because as a journalist, especially as a leading interviewer, but watched by, like they said, nation wants to know. So does that affect you? Has that affected your career? And how does it affect your work as a journalist when you don't have access to people in power, when people in ministers who make important decisions? How has that affected your career?
There's no doubt that not being able to interview the BJP or the top BJP leaders or even BJP spokesmen has had a fairly massive impact on my work as an interviewer, because interviewers are supposed to have access to the government, are supposed to hold government ministers accountable. And when the boycott began in 2017-18, it was a sudden hatchet. It just completely stopped overnight. Ministers who had committed themselves to doing interviews in the next 3, 4, 5 days, week or 10 days, just cancelled all of them. The last person that I interviewed from the BJP was Ram Madhav. It happened about 6 weeks after the boycott had begun. And I said to him at the end of the interview, "Thank you very much indeed. I'm deeply grateful." And my crew and all were there listening. And he said, "Don't be grateful to me. My party will be very angry I've spoken to you." So I said, "Why will your party be angry?" He said, "Because I was told not to speak to you." But he said, "I don't believe in boycotts. I don't believe in not talking to people. So I've given the interview. Now I have to face my party." But yes, of course it makes a big difference, because the BJP side of the story, questioning the BJP, is something that I no longer can do. I have to find proxies who are willing to talk to me to represent their viewpoint. By sheer coincidence, I got rung up last night, or was it day before last night, I can't remember, by a particular publisher who's published a book by Ram Madhav and asked, would I be willing to interview him? And the book happens to be on great speeches delivered by RSS leaders over the years. And I was honest. I said, look, I would love to interview Ram Madhav. I would be delighted to interview Ram Madhav, but I am not interested in great speeches delivered by RSS leaders over the year. But I'm happy to talk to Mr. Madhav, in fact, delighted to talk to Mr. Madhav about politics, about issues of the day, about Trump, about tariffs, about Pakistan, if need be, even about cricket. But great speeches delivered by RSS leaders does not interest me. Now, whether that interview ever happens or not, they came back and suggested to me, why don't I agree to a 50-50 divide, 50% on the speeches, 50% on other issues of the day. To which I said no, because even to do 50% on the speeches means reading the book, and I'm not particularly interested in reading a book of great speeches by RSS leaders.
One last question before we open
Any number of questions.
Madhu Trahan's interview I watched with great interest. She said that you were pushing Pakistan's agenda through your writing, and you of course dismissed it as, and you were sharing a joke with her. So does writing about another view that the mainstream does not seem to agree with, does that make you somehow antagonistic to the national interest?
I don't think expressing from time to time a point of view that happens to be a Pakistani point of view makes you a Pakistani. Just as much as expressing an American or a British or a Russian or a Chinese point of view doesn't make you American, British, Russian or Chinese. Madhu Triyan has a sort of, how shall I put it, a bee in her bonnet about this subject. The truth is that that particular interview was recorded over 50 minutes. And there were two big subjects that she raised. One was that I was a Pakistani spy. She claimed that my father was a Pakistani spy.
She didn't say that.
Or some such thing.
No.
And that I asked questions only from a Pakistani point of view, that I'm advocating Pakistan's cause. The second half of the interview, she censored completely, because there she got it fundamentally and totally wrong. And forgive me, but I will be honest, she didn't have the courage to show where she'd made a terrible mistake. She spent 25 minutes questioning me about why I was being rude to Field Marshal Manekshaw. And I said, I think you've misunderstood the interview completely. No. She pointed to a particular clip that she showed. There, you're being rude to him. I said, look at the full interview. Actually, we're having fun and laughing, and that's a joke. For 25 minutes, she went on, realized she'd made a terrible mistake, and dropped that entire 25-minute chunk. And frankly, I think that is a dishonest thing for interviewers to do.
Who would Karan Thapar love to be interviewed by from the current lot of television interviewers?
I'd love to be interviewed by Rajdeep Sardesai.
That's like...
He did it...
That's a cozy arrangement, isn't it?
Well, many people who do interviews are known to each other, so it would always look to others as if it's a cozy interview. I'd love to be interviewed by Rahul Shivshankar, but that also is because he happens to be my nephew. I'd love to be interviewed by Barkha Dutt. I'd love to be interviewed by Shiv Tharoor. He's been very kind to me about interviews that I have done, which he's seen, and he was very sweet and generous to praise. I'd love to be interviewed by him. I have no problem being interviewed by anyone, provided that the object of the exercise is to ask me questions. And even if they want to do it because they want to box me into a corner, then show the whole interview. Don't edit it to suit your own purposes. Let the entire discussion go out, either live or for live, and I have no problem. People have often axes to grind. Go right ahead and grind them as much as you want.